From New York, this is Democracy Now!
What we have right now is unbridled corruption in states like Texas and Georgia, where they have voted to empower politicians with the power to override the people in the next election. And the only antidote to state-level voter suppression and that type of corruption, quite frankly, is strong federal voting rights bills. That's how we ended Jim Crow, and that's how we have to deal with this situation.
Republicans may retake control of the House next year, thanks largely to extreme gerrymandering by Republican state legislatures. We'll look at the fight over voting rights with Ben Jealous of People for the American Way, who's been arrested repeatedly in voting rights protests recently. And we'll talk to journalist Ari Berman of Mother Jones. Then to climate colonialism. Why was Occupied Western Sahara silenced at the UN Climate Summit?
Morocco is undertaking a huge campaign to greenwash its ugly face of military occupation of our territory and embark on this propaganda campaign that is friendly to the environment, using its military occupation to Western Sahara to pass through this message.
And the House of Representatives is voting today to censure Republican Congressmember Paul Gosar for posting an animated video of him murdering Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We'll speak with Gosar's own sister, who describes the congressman as a sociopath. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As COVID-19 cases continue to creep up in the United States, averaging around 85,000 daily cases, the Biden administration plans to purchase 10 million courses of Pfizer's new COVID pill. Paxlovid has been shown to reduce hospitalization and death by nearly 90% in high-risk adults during trials. Pfizer requested emergency use authorization for the oral treatment Tuesday. This comes as Pfizer announced a deal to make the pill available more cheaply in 95 low- and middle-income nations by allowing it to be manufactured as a generic. Vaccine equity advocates say the move is a good first step, but condemn the fact that the deal excludes so many countries. Doctors Without Borders said, quote, "The world knows by now that access to COVID-19 medical tools needs to be guaranteed for everyone, everywhere, if we really want to control this pandemic." Meanwhile, vaccine makers continue to report massive profits from COVID treatments. Oxfam found Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna are making combined profits of more than $1,000 every second, or $65,000 every minute. In more vaccine news, the FDA is expected to authorize Pfizer booster shots for all adults as early as this week. A number of states have already expanded booster eligibility to all vaccinated adults, including California, Colorado, and New York. In news from Canada, catastrophic flooding has killed at least one person in British Columbia and forced thousands to evacuate their homes. Some areas in the Pacific Northwest received nearly 10 inches of rain, triggering landslides and overflowing rivers. 3 major highways connecting Vancouver to the Canadian interior have been washed out. The flooding also forced the temporary shutdown of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The climate-fueled record rainfall comes just months after wildfires devastated some of the same areas of British Columbia. Meteorologist Eric Holthaus tweeted, quote, "After the hottest heat wave in Pacific Northwest history this summer, the rainy season there has begun with torrential flooding. We're in a climate emergency," he said. In Australia, climate activists has disrupted rail shipments into the port of Newcastle for an 11th consecutive day in a nonviolent direct action campaign aimed at halting exports from the world's largest coal port. Some of the activists have locked their bodies to rail cars and railroad tracks, while others suspended themselves on platforms or giant tripods in the path of trains, forcing long delays as police struggled to remove them. At least 19 people have been arrested on charges that could see some of them jailed for up to 25 years. On Tuesday, activists suspended themselves from massive pieces of machinery halting operations in the coal port.
I'm taking this action on the stolen land of the Worimi and the Awabakal people. This land was never ceded over by these people, and Australia has been committing genocide against the first people of this land for 250 years now. Australia has been brutalising the first people, has been brutalising the land and the water.
In Kenosha, Wisconsin, the jury in the trial of the white teenage gunman Kyle Rittenhouse is deliberating for a second day today. Rittenhouse fatally shot 2 people and wounded a third during protests over the police shooting of Jacob Blake in 2020. In a highly unusual move, Rittenhouse was instructed by Judge Bruce Schrader Tuesday to randomly draw the names of 6 jurors who were removed from the pool of 18 citizens who were sitting on the jury. The 12 remaining jurors then proceeded to deliberation. The random selection is typically done by a member of the court. One legal expert called Schrader's decision, quote, an interesting piece of theater. Meanwhile, it's been revealed, trial consultant Joellen Demetrius, known for shaping jury selection in the O.J. Simpson trial, worked with Rittenhouse attorneys in their selection process and closing arguments. In another closely watched trial, the state of Georgia has rested its case in the trial of 3 white men accused of killing Ahmaud Arbery, the black jogger. On Tuesday, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy testified that Ahmaud died after being shot 3 times at close range. 2 of the bullets hit him, including one that tore a big hole in the center of his chest. The jury was shown graphic video of Arbery's wounds and his blood-soaked white T-shirt. The defense is beginning its case today. In Oklahoma, advocates have been rallying outside the barricaded governor's mansion ahead of the planned Thursday execution of prisoner Julius Jones. Jones was convicted of a 1999 murder, but has maintained his innocence. Oklahoma's Pardon and Parole Board recommended that his death sentence be commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole, but the final decision now rests with Governor Kevin Stitt. The White House has revealed President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping have agreed for the 2 nations to begin holding nuclear arms talks. For decades, the U.S. has maintained a vastly larger nuclear arsenal, but China's been investing in new nuclear arms technology. Earlier this year, China tested a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile. Satellite imagery suggests China's also building more than 100 new intercontinental missile silos. Meanwhile, the United States is planning to spend over $1 trillion in coming decades to modernize its nuclear arsenal. In Burma, the military junta, which seized power in the February 1st coup, has charged overthrown civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi with election fraud and lawless actions. Aung San Suu Kyi has been detained since February and is facing multiple other charges in secretive, closed-door court proceedings. Meanwhile, the U.S. journalist Danny Fenster landed in New York Tuesday after being released from a Burmese prison on Monday.
Journalists and prisoners of conscience in Myanmar and everywhere else, for me in Myanmar, just a lot of citizens, doctors, teachers that are in prison right now. And, you know, that's another point that everybody here is reiterating. This will be a short little celebration, but, you know, let's keep focused on what the actual story is here.
Myanmar is what the Burmese military renamed Burma. A Burmese rights group has recorded over 10,000 arrests since the February coup. According to the UN, 126 members of the press have been arrested, with 47 currently in detention. In Chile, the Senate voted against impeaching President Sebastián Piñera, putting an end to the removal effort that was launched after allegations of corruption and financial misdeeds emerged following revelations in the Pandora Papers leak. The Biden administration's banned Nicaraguan government officials, including President Daniel Ortega and his wife, Vice President Rosario Murillo, from entering the United States following recent elections, which saw Ortega reelected for a fourth time, in which the U.S. and others have denounced as rigged. Leading up to the vote, authorities arrested some 40 opposition figures, including 7 prospective presidential challengers. The travel ban came one day after the U.S. announced separate financial sanctions on Nicaragua. Ortega has long accused the U.S. government of interfering in Nicaragua and supporting a coup attempt in 2018. The Nicaraguan Congress has also denounced the Organization of American States for passing a resolution declaring the election lacked democratic legitimacy. In Burkina Faso, hundreds of protesters took to the streets of the capital Ouagadougou on Tuesday to demand President Roch Kabore resign after a recent militant attack on a defense outpost in the northern border region killed 28 soldiers and 4 civilians. It was the worst recorded attack against troops during a 4-year conflict that's killed thousands and displaced over 1 million people. Protesters on Tuesday also demanded the departure of French forces that patrol Burkina Faso, as well as neighboring Mali and Niger, whose presence, they say, leads to more attacks by insurgent groups.
We are not happy. There are too many killings. We are fed up. How many widows? How many orphans in this country? We came out in 2014 to create some change, but now there's no change. Nothing has changed. The worst is here. They told us it will not be like before. Why are we still seeing the worst?
The State Department announced the U.S. is curbing refugee admissions in order to prioritize the resettlement of thousands of Afghan evacuees. The pause on admitting certain groups of refugees will run through January 11th. The U.S. admitted just 400 refugees in October, despite President Biden's commitment to resettling up to 125,000 refugees this fiscal year. North Dakota's Republican Governor Doug Burgum has signed legislation banning the teaching of critical race theory. Public schools are now barred from teaching students that, quote, racism is systemically embedded in American society and the American legal system to facilitate racial inequality, unquote. A Connecticut judge ruled far-right conspiracy theorist and InfoWars host Alex Jones was liable for damages in lawsuits brought by families of children killed in the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre after Jones failed to turn over documents to the court. For years, Jones spread conspiracy theories that the shooting was a government hoax and the victims' families were paid actors, resulting in online harassment and death threats for Sandy Hook families. The 2012 massacre claimed the lives of 20 school children and 6 educators. And in labor news, workers at 5 branches of Pacific Northwest restaurant chain Burgerville have become the country's first fast food employees to successfully unionize. The tentative agreement with Burgerville includes expanded sick leave, vacation benefits, paid parental leave, and a reliable 3-month schedule. It also guarantees pay rates that are higher than the statewide minimum wage. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, Republicans may retake control of the House next year, thanks largely to extreme gerrymandering by Republican state legislators. We'll look at the fight over voting rights with Ben Jealous of People for the American Way, who's been repeatedly arrested over voting rights in Washington in recent months, and with journalist Ari Berman of Mother Jones. Stay with us. nation of language. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show looking at how Republicans could retake the House next year thanks to extreme gerrymandering by Republican state lawmakers that could shape politics for the next decade. This comes as critical legislation to protect voting rights is languishing at the federal level. Today, voting rights groups are holding the last in a series of protests at the White House, where nearly 100 people have been arrested since August. Now 100 more are risking arrest to call on Democrats to push through two key bills. Among those detained at a November 3rd protest, the same day Republican senators blocked the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s 13-year-old granddaughter, Yolanda King. It was her first act of civil disobedience.
I march because I want change, not just for me, but for everyone who comes next. My grandma said, every generation has to earn their freedom. I believe our generations can free the generations yet to be born. Adults have failed us, so we need to take matters into our own hands. And finally, I march because I know activism works. I've seen it in my own family. When President Reagan refused to pass the King bill to make MLK Day an official holiday, my grandma met with many political leaders to tell them why it was so important. People marched, demonstrated, and used their voices. And eventually, Reagan signed the bill. This is what we are going to do today, to protect the right to vote. As a 13-year-old and an activist, here's my question to elected officials. Why are you in office? Are you here for power, or are you here to stop silence, or are you here to use your platform for good? If you are here for good, it's time to stop silencing our voices. We need critical bills passed. The Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. These bills cannot wait.
That's 13-year-old activist Yolanda King, the only granddaughter of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., speaking at a protest outside the White House earlier this month. For more on today's protest and the urgent calls for Democrats to fix or nix the filibuster and pass federal voting rights legislation, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way, former president of the NAACP. And we're joined by Ari Berman, senior reporter for Mother Jones, where his latest piece is headlined, Republicans are erasing decades of voting rights gains before our eyes. Ari's the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Ben, let's begin with you. Thank you for joining us right before you go to the White House. Again today, another plan for civil disobedience. Talk about why you have been repeatedly arrested.
We are in a moment in this country when states are suppressing the vote across the South, across the Midwest, even out in the far West. And there's really only one way to stop it, which is that the Senate, the Congress has to pass urgently needed federal voting rights bills now. The John Lewis bill and the Freedom to Vote Act, which was authored part by Joe Manchin himself. We have the 51 votes. Vice President Kamala Harris has done her job in getting that consensus as president of the Senate. And now we need President Joe Biden, to do his job and to call on the Senate to create a path for an up or down vote on these bills so we can stop this voter suppression now.
And Ben, how do you see the parallels between what the activists are doing today, pressuring President Biden, and what happened really a generation ago in the efforts to pressure LBJ around voting rights back then, and even something you're more directly familiar with, the movement to pressure the Reagan administration over apartheid and U.S. complicity with the apartheid government in South Africa? Now,
there's Martin Luther King III told a story at the last protest of his father, Martin Luther King Jr., meeting with President Johnson when the '64 Civil Rights Act was passed. And Martin Luther King said to President Johnson, it's time for us to now pass the Voting Rights Act. And President Johnson said, there's just no way. And Martin Luther King said to his lieutenants as they walked out of the meeting, we're just going to have to make him do it. And that's where we are right now. We know that President Biden understands the importance of stopping these bills. But what we haven't seen is him actually call on the Senate to get the job done. President Trump called on the Senate to create a carve-out in the filibuster to pack the courts with the Supreme Court with far right-wing justices. Joe Biden can certainly do that to save our democracy. So, and then when you go back to Reagan and the anti-apartheid protests, Joe Madison, who was one of the leaders of those, who is a Sirius XM radio host, is now on a hunger strike, again, calling on Joe Biden to just simply stand up and call on the Senate to create a path for an up or down vote on these bills. We believe that majorities matter, and if they do, then they should matter in the U.S. Senate. We have the votes. The bills should be passed.
And in terms of this, the efforts by Republicans in state after state to turn back the voting rights of people across the country, you're concerned of the most flagrant examples of this and what it will mean for the elections coming next year and then the presidential elections of a couple of years down the road.
In general, these bills are meant to make it harder for people to vote. The most extreme thing we've seen is actually state legislatures give themselves the power to ultimately overturn entire statewide elections and impose their will on the people of their own state. It's the most anti-democratic thing that I've ever seen. And what troubles me, my grandmother turned 105 this week. Her grandfather was born into slavery, and he was one of the last blacks to serve in Virginia during Reconstruction in the state legislature. And my grandmother carries the pain that her grandfather had of watching his colleagues vote to suppress his constituents to ensure that men like him could never serve in office again. Now, in all of my fighting against incursions on voting rights in our country, what I've never experienced before this year is colleagues calling me and saying, I may not run statewide because I'm worried that my state's legislature will overturn the election if they don't like the results. That's something that has simply never happened in the history of U.S. democracy before, and it should be troubling all of us. That's why these bills have to be passed.
So, Ben, describe what happens when you go outside the White House and talk about why you're going there.
What we've seen is that these protests keep growing. The first time no one got arrested. The second time it was 5 people. The third time it was 25 people. Last time it was 62 people. Today we have over 150 that have signed up, and we're expecting buses more coming in from places like Detroit and Georgia. And we expect that many people coming off of those buses will want to get arrested too. What people understand is that our democracy is being harmed in a profound way. And if these bills are not passed by Christmas, then redistricting next year will be done in a way that will be incredibly undemocratic, incredibly partisan, incredibly gerrymandered. This is our last chance to really, quite frankly, get to a place that for the next decade, we will actually have districts that reflect the people of the state and not the ambitions of the politicians who run those states now.
You know, we should comment, we're running video of the protests. Joe Madison, the well-known talk show host, is on hunger fast right now around these issues, around these bills. I wanted to bring in Ari Berman, who writes for Mother Jones, is well-known for his book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Can you connect the redistricting and what's happening now, a level we have not seen before, with the filibuster and these 2 bills?
Yeah, Amy and Juan, we are seeing the greatest rollback of voting rights since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and the greatest attempt to reduce the influence and power of voters of color since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. The most extreme gerrymandering efforts since the Voting Rights Act was enacted. And if you look at state after state after state, the same states that are pushing voter suppression are also pushing extreme gerrymandered maps to lock in white Republican power for the next decade at the state and federal level, whether it's Texas or Georgia or North Carolina. And so what Republicans did is they tried to overturn the election, then they tried to rig elections through voter suppression, and now they are rigging elections through gerrymandering. So it's a step-by-step process to undermine our democracy. And the federal legislation that has been proposed by Democrats and filibustered by Republicans would stop these efforts, would make it easier to vote, and would also ban partisan gerrymandering. So the kind of extreme gerrymandering we're seeing in places like Texas and North Carolina and Georgia, where these are 50-50 states, but Republicans are proposing to have 60, 70, in some cases 80% of seats for the state legislature and for the U.S. House through these gerrymandered maps. And Democrats are really running out of time to pass this federal legislation. We are already seeing state after state enact gerrymandered maps. We've already seen them pass voter suppression laws, and there hasn't been a Democratic response yet. Republicans have filibustered 4 different voting rights bills this year. 4 different filibusters of 3 different voting rights bills. And so there really needs to be a sense of urgency to overcome the filibuster to save our democracy, or Republicans are going to rig the next decade of elections.
Ari, you write that North Carolina's 3 largest heavily Democratic counties, Wake, Mecklenburg, and Guilford, will each be split into 3 different congressional districts to dilute the power of communities of color and enhance the power of white rural areas. Could you talk about this in connection to the Supreme? Because in previous redistrictings, this would have to have gone through Justice Department pre-clearance as a result of the Voting Rights Act. The impact of the Supreme Court decision on voting rights that now makes it possible for this kind of gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering, in effect, to proceed.
Well, Juan, there's been 2 disastrous decisions by the Supreme Court for voting rights and redistricting. One was in 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act and ruled that states with a long history of discrimination no longer have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. And another was in 2019, where they said that the federal courts can't even review partisan gerrymandering cases. And this opened the floodgates to more and more extreme gerrymandering, so that states with a long history, like North Carolina, they had their maps struck down in 2011 for racial gerrymandering and for partisan gerrymandering. And now they're doing the very thing that the federal courts and the state courts told them not to do, which is drawing districts in a 50-50 state that will give Republicans upwards of 70% of seats for the state legislature and for the U.S. House, and doing it by diluting the votes and the voices of communities of color, by packing them into as few urban areas as possible, and then splitting up heavily Democratic areas like Charlotte, like the Research Triangle, into as many white rural districts as possible to preserve white Republican power. And we've seen that not just in North Carolina, but in Texas and in Georgia and other places where all of the demographic changes are from communities of color. And that should benefit Democrats because communities of color are more likely to support Democrats than Republicans. But Republicans are drawing the districts in such a way that maintain Republican power in the face of these big and massive demographic changes.
All right, let's go to Georgia. On Monday, the legislature passed a gerrymandered state Senate map giving Republicans 59% of seats in Georgia for the next decade. The map reshapes a district held by Democratic State Senator Michelle O and makes it lean heavily Republican. This is Georgia State Rep for Georgia, Bean Wen, responding on the House floor.
My colleague on the Senate side, who currently represents Senate District 48, is the only Asian woman in the Senate, 1 out of 56 members. It means when 6 Asian women are brutally murdered in our state, we know there will be at least 1 woman on the Senate side. who can speak about cultural barriers, who can speak about language barriers, and who can speak about the fears that plague the Asian American community, just like the senator did from Senate District 48 earlier this year. And here we are, a state. We've added 1 million Georgians, Asian Americans being the fastest growing population in our state. And the majority party drew a map that targets the only Asian woman in the Senate, and they did so by diluting the voices of black and brown voters.
So that's Georgia State Legislator B. Nguyen. Ari Berman.
That's really indicative of what Republicans are doing everywhere, which is they are dismantling diverse districts in which African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans are joining together to elect their candidates of choice. And all of the demographic changes in Georgia and the South are from those groups, are from communities of color. But instead of having more representation for communities of color because of that population growth, there's actually going to be less representation for communities of color. And so this is really an effort to dismantle the diversifying new American majority and to maintain white Republican power in the face of these demographic changes. And it's also an attempt to try to take away competitive seats, because Georgia was the most competitive state in the country for the president and for the U.S. Senate. But if you look at these state legislative maps that were passed by Republicans in Georgia, there's almost no competitive districts for the state legislature or for the U.S. House. That's the same thing they did in North Carolina. That's the same thing they did in Texas. So I really want people to understand they are rigging the next decade of elections. Election results are basically going to be predetermined for many races at the state and federal level in places like Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, because of the maps that are being passed right now. That's how serious of a crisis for democracy this is.
Well, I want to thank you, Ari Berman, Mother Jones journalist, for being with us. We'll link to your piece. Republicans are erasing decades of voting rights gains before our eyes, and author of Give Us the Ballot. And before you go, Ben Jealous, most likely to be arrested today, I wanted to ask you about another issue, about what's happening in Oklahoma. Advocates have been rallying outside the barricaded governor's mansion ahead of the planned Thursday execution of prisoner Julius Jones, who was convicted of a 1999 murder, but has maintained his innocence. Another man, Christopher Jordan, has privately admitted to committing the murder and framing Jones. That's according to 3 people who were jailed with Jordan, who served 15 years after reaching a plea deal in the case. Oklahoma's Pardon and Parole Board has recommended twice that Julius Jones' death sentence be commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole. But the final decision now rests with Governor Kevin Stitt. You've long been an anti-death penalty activist, standing outside the execution prisons like of Troy Anthony Davis murder, who spent half his life on death row and ultimately was executed in Georgia. Your thoughts on what's happening possibly tomorrow?
This is an extreme injustice. The one eyewitness described a man with 1.5 inches of hair, and Julius' head was clean shaven. Julius had an alibi. He was eating dinner with his family at the time, and that was not introduced. The prosecutor in the case, Bill Macy, a man who would dress up like Colonel Sanders before he went into court each day and was known to carry firearms into court, has had 1/3 of his death penalty cases overturned for prosecutorial misconduct, and frankly has sent many innocent people to death row. There should be no doubt that Julius Jones is innocent. And that is frankly substantiated by the fact that it wasn't just that they voted to recommend to the governor that this execution be stayed. They did so 3-1 in the state of Oklahoma, which quite frankly is a state that's generally a fan of the death penalty. And so this case, really, there should be no debate about. They need to stop the execution, and quite frankly, they need to reopen the trial in this case.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way, former president of the NAACP, headed out to the White House today. About 100 people are expected to be arrested in a voting rights demonstration. Thanks so much for being with us. As we move on to what's happening in Congress today, this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Republican Congressmember Paul Gosar faces censure for his posting of an animated video on social media where he murders Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and attacks President Biden. The censure resolution is the most severe form of punishment in the House. Congressman Gosar will be required to stand in the well of the House while the resolution is read. The House will also vote to strip Gosar of his assignments on the Committee on Oversight and Reform, where he serves alongside Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez, and the House Committee on Natural Resources. Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez approved of the move to censure, saying, quote, threatening the life of a colleague is grounds for expulsion. But given the Republican Party, especially the leader, is too cowardly to really enforce any standard of conduct, censure and committee removal is the next most appropriate step, she said. This is House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking Tuesday.
Why go after him?
Yes.
Because he made threats, suggestions about harming a member of Congress. That is an insult, not only an endangerment of that member of Congress, but an insult to the institution of the House of Representatives. We cannot have members joking about murdering each other, as well as threatening the President of the United States.
This comes as some Republicans have called out Republican leadership for not taking action against Gosar, even as they call to punish the 13 Republican lawmakers who voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Congressmember Liz Cheney of Wyoming, who also sits on the Oversight Committee with Congressmember Gosar, called the inaction indefensible. This past weekend, the Wyoming Republican Party voted to kick Cheney out of the party. While Gosar has taken down the video, he's refused to apologize. On Tuesday, he met with House Republicans during a closed-door conference meeting. Gosar spoke later on the Stu Peters show.
Well, I don't know. We had conference this morning, so I explained to them what was happening. I did not apologize. I just said this video had nothing to do with harming anybody. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's an anime. We were trying to reach out to the newer generation that likes these anime, these cartoons fabricated in Japanese likeness.
Congressmember Gosar has also spread conspiracy theories about the deadly white nationalist rally in Charlottesville in 2017 and the January 6th attack on the Capitol, calling the rioters peaceful patriots. This comes as Arizona Republican Congressmember Gosar's own sister, Jennifer Gosar, has called him a sociopath and said his behavior could escalate. She and two of her siblings wrote a piece headlined, "Our brother Paul Gosar needs to be stopped. Merrick Garland, are you listening?" She joins us now from Seattle. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jennifer Gosar. It's really important to have you with us. You are the youngest of 10, a sister of the Representative Paul Gosar?
Yeah, that's correct. There are seven brothers and two sisters, and I'm the youngest, and he is the eldest.
So tell us your reaction when you saw this animated video of your brother, posted by your brother, murdering Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I was incensed, to be honest with you, but I also felt like a bone-chilling fear because the way in which that murder takes place in the, quote, anime video, and let's be clear, there is no joking here. The AZ Mirror, some of the Arizona papers have done some really great reporting on this, and in fact, connected that same account to a 2016 anime version as well, which again hits that same anime cartoon. And again, like, this is something that is not a joke. But to be honest with you, the way in which that happens, that I found it bone-chilling, honestly.
And in 2018, you and 5 other siblings were part of an ad campaign for the Democratic challenger to Congressmember Gosar during that election. 3 years later, are the feelings among all 6 of you still the same about the role of your brother?
I don't. When these types of press requests come up, they come up very quickly. So I don't check. But to be honest with you, I'm clear that my brothers and sisters are not about attempted death threats to women of color. They're not intimidated, and they also do not believe in that kind of sinister approach to governance, right? They don't. They understand, as I do, that Paul is incompetent at his office, that he's never been competent, but that the election of Donald Trump has furthered his visibility and furthered his work, and he certainly utilized it. And in fact, if you look at his statement, again, there is reporting that shows that he's not only not apologizing, he's continuing to sing to that white supremacist base that he fundraises from. So it's quite concerning, and I'm pleasantly surprised that they've actually taken the step to have the censure vote and strip him of his committee assignments. It's the first step. It's a good step, but I don't think that's all it's called for here.
And I wanted to ask you, given the deep polarization that continues in American society, many families are confronting these deep divisions within their own families. And as we head into the holiday season and Thanksgiving, your thoughts about how families grapple with these deep divisions among siblings and parents and grandparents?
Yeah, it's torturous. I've had people reach out to me from across the country to say, thank you for standing up. I, too, have problems in my family. You know, there are parallels to this with prior to the Civil War here in the United States. So in thinking about this, I think the most important thing to do is to stick with your integrity, to hear that voice, to reach out with compassion, but be clear, be strong, because if we don't stand up to this, it only worsens. Not only have we seen that happen in our country, but across the globe, when authoritarianism, when fascism is not stood up to, when it is not stymied with strong, assertive response, it only grows and the cruelty only increases.
Have you spoken to your brother Paul, Jennifer?
No, I don't speak to him. I have no desire to have communication with him. At a personal level, I gave up. When we did those ads in 2018, that was really, for me, a level of clarity, because I realized that the internal conflict I had as an interpreter, sitting with people every day in their healthcare, listening to, stories of all kinds of trauma, complex PTSD, the effects of poverty as it strips a body's ability to maintain itself, right? As I sat with people, I felt like a hypocrite because I didn't know where to speak up. I didn't know who would listen to me. So when the ads came up, I felt like that was the opportunity and I was not going to miss it. And it made it clear to me that at a personal level, my relationship with him was done and that I was going to reengage publicly because I needed the help of others to actually hold him accountable, that I myself or the efforts of my brothers and sisters proved useless, that we needed actually a bigger intervention in order to hold him accountable.
And I wanted to ask you, we only have about a minute left, but the January 6th events in the Capitol, the attempted coup, and later hearing your brother, Congressmember Gosar, saying promising blanket pardons for organizers of that day. Your reactions?
Well, isn't that hypocritical, right? And in fact, he asked for a pardon himself. So, if this is somebody who is innocent of all charges, then why was he asking for a pardon? Why was he dangling pardons? And why aren't they actually considering that a little bit more? Because, one of the things that some of the supporters and rioters themselves have talked about is that here was they showed up for Trump, but Trump hasn't backed them. Well, of course, we know that would be the case. That is Donald Trump. That is Donald J. Trump in a nutshell. But of course, my brother pertains to that. And I think it's interesting how he wants to cover over it with more zealotry and more fundraising. But the truth is, he wasn't there for his own people. And if he were, in fact, innocent of all those things, why would he offer them a pardon preemptively? Why would he seek a pardon for himself?
What do you think he will be feeling today if he does go into the well of the House? This is highly unusual. You've called him a sociopath. You demanded the Democrats do something about him since McCarthy is willing to throw Republicans off of committees and threaten them if they even vote with Democrats, but has not in any way even condemned Gosar.
Yeah, I think if he shows up, I mean, that is a question for us. Will he actually show up? I can tell you, I can imagine his skin crawling at having to hear Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, read him the censure. I can see that being one of the most tiring things for him. Without, honestly, the step of taking his committees, I think it would almost be laughable to him that he would feel like, well, they can't do anything. They won't do anything. They're just a bunch of gutless, cowards, right? So to take his committee censure, which Representative Grijalva was reported to suggest for this particular censure motion, I think is critical, right? But I think if he actually shows up, he will be utterly ired at having to hear Nancy Pelosi read that to him.
Well, Jennifer Gosar, I want to thank you so much for being with us. The youngest sister of Arizona Republican Congressmember Paul Gosar, who's being censured by the House today. Next up, climate colonialism. Why was Occupied Western Sahara silenced at the UN Climate Summit? Back in 30 seconds.
Trace the dripping, pierced heart. Speak the fair, insistent verse. Vow to God and slip apart. Little better, little worse.
Recurrence by Marian Gedrin. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. The British government's facing widespread criticism for excluding critical voices from negotiations at the UN Climate Summit. One group excluded was climate negotiators from Western Sahara, which has been occupied by Morocco since 1975. Last week, Western Sahara publicly revealed its plan to reduce carbon emissions, but their announcement was not made inside the UN Summit, but at the People's Summit in Glasgow, because its negotiators aren't accredited by the UN. Meanwhile, Morocco is using renewable energy developments in Western Sahara to count towards its climate pledges. Last week, we spoke with climate change consultant Nick Brooks and Obi Bashir, the representative of the Polisario Front for Europe and the European Union. I began by asking Obi Bashir why Western Sahara was not represented at the UN summit.
Unfortunately, till now, the Sahrawi Republic is not yet a member of the United Nations. Of course, one day, certainly, it will join the rest of the nations of the world and gain its seat in the United Nations, but pending the end of the decolonization process and the independence of Western Sahara, we are not yet admitted as a full member in the UN. And on the basis of that condition, the Sahrawi Republic could not, unfortunately, present its NDC, nationally determined contribution to the international climate system. And that's why we are here in Glasgow. Unfortunately, Morocco is undertaking a huge campaign to greenwash its ugly face of military occupation of our territory and embark on this propaganda campaign that is friendly to the environment, using its military occupation to Western Sahara to pass through this message. We know that Morocco is now executing some projects, especially on the renewable energy, on the wind energy, but also on the solar share in the occupied part of Western Sahara, using also the assistance and the partnership with some international multinational companies such as the Italian Enel and also the Spanish Siemens Gamesa, who are now on a major project in Western Sahara. Just to give you a sense of the statistics that we have, that maybe by 2030 the entire wind energy that will be produced in Western Sahara, around almost 47% of it will be illegally produced from Western Sahara. On the solar energy, around 10%, and it may reach even until 30% of the global solar energy produced or announced to be produced by Morocco. It will be produced from within a context, an illegal context of occupation. And unfortunately, the international climate system, the UN Conference on Climate Change, is receiving receiving those data that have been submitted by Morocco, and we think it's not the right thing to do. It is illegal because this energy has been produced in a context of violation of the international law. The European Court of Justice, General Court of Justice, just issued its decision last month on September. On the 29th of September, annulling two agreements that have been passed between the European Union and the Kingdom of Morocco, because there is no legal basis of that, because the consent of the people of Western Sahara was not achieved by the European Union and Morocco in this regard, and the abuses of human rights are largely and widely denounced by all international humanitarian organizations. So this is the real ugly face of the Moroccan occupation to our territory.
I wanted to bring in Nick Brooks. You've been a climate consultant traveling to Western Sahara for about 20 years or so. Could you talk about the report that Obi mentions? It notes that the World Bank puts the offshore wind power potential of Western Sahara at 169% greater than that of Morocco. And so could you talk about the importance of Western Sahara in terms of renewable energy, and also where is the African Union in all this? What's its stance in recent years on the continued occupation of the territory?
Okay, thank you. I think on the African Union question, I'll probably ultimately defer back to Ubi. He knows this issue much better than I do. But on the importance of the report and the role of Western Sahara in combating climate change, certainly the potential for renewables is enormous there. And we're already seeing Morocco beginning to exploit that. And as Ubi mentioned, one of the key issues here is the issue of climate justice. And what we're seeing is a lot of the principles that are embedded in the Paris Agreement on climate change actually being ignored or essentially abused. When we've got a situation where Morocco's performance against its own climate targets is going to be dependent on the exploitation of renewable energy from an occupied territory, then that is contrary to the Paris Agreement principles of transparency, of accuracy, of inclusion, and of equity. So that in itself is very important. So Western Sahara can play a role in combating climate change, in producing clean energy, but at the moment that's happening through the mechanisms of Moroccan occupation and colonialism. So one of the roles of the report is to try and highlight this issue and to try and amplify, give the Sahrawi a voice, because as Ubi said, they have been completely and systematically excluded from international processes of climate governance and climate finance. If we take the finance, for example, we can look at the amount of finance going to neighbouring countries in 2019. Just in terms of formal multilateral climate finance to Morocco, we're looking at about $300 million. If we look at Mauritania, it's about 17 million, a little less for Algeria. Sorry, 75 million for Mauritania and about 17 million for Algeria. Western Sahara received nothing. So this is public money from donor countries to climate funds, formal climate funds, that gets channeled to help developing countries address the impacts of climate change and develop low-carbon societies and economies. So again, Western Sahara is completely excluded from this, and so they're denied the resources with which they could adapt and with which they could... and I think we're emphasising mitigation here, but mitigation being reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and transitions to clean energy. But adaptation is also hugely important. Most of the Sahrawi live as refugees in the Algerian desert, in the refugee camps. And these are areas that are already really, really harsh and will suffer some of the worst impacts of climate change. We're talking about a big increase in the number of days where the temperature, exceeds 50 degrees Celsius, for example. That zone in a recent report was classified as being at the edge of a region of extreme risk from heat extremes, with real consequences for sort of human welfare, human mortality and morbidity. We talked about the floods as well. The Sahrawi refugee camps, while we're looking at a general reduction in water availability and increased heat, what rainfall that is coming in more intense and more extreme bursts. And so this is causing devastating floods. And one of the robust findings about the impacts of climate change is that we expect more of these intense rainfall events, increasing flood risk.
Let me respond to the question on the African Union. As you know, the Sahrawi Republic is a member of the Organization of the African Unity since 1984, and Morocco withdrew as a sign to, as a position to protest against our admission. But then Morocco tried from outside to influence on our position and failed because of the commitment of all African countries behind the cause of the Sahrawi people, the cause of the people that are struggling in what is known inside the African Union as Africa's last colony, which is Western Sahara. And in 2017, Morocco decided to submit a petition to be admitted in the African Union, and now is sitting side by side to the Sahrawi Republic. We thought that we are by then, in 2017, in a similar scenario like the one that Morocco was doing with Mauritania by the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, where started contesting the membership of Mauritania in the Organization of the African Union, but ended up accepting it. We thought that after the era of contestation, Morocco would have been now in the era of wisdom. But unfortunately, that was not the case, and Morocco is still on the same policy of not only occupying Western Sahara, military occupying, abusing the human rights of the people, plundering the natural resources of the territory, but at the same time defying any international attempt to decolonize the territory and to organize the referendum of self-determination that has been promised to the Sahrawi people and constitutes until now the only way to settle the conflict in conformity with the international law. The African Union in March this year, after the resumption of the armed struggle in Western Sahara as a result of the Moroccan violation of the terms of the ceasefire in November last year, the African Union, the Peace and Security at the summit conference passed a resolution asking the two member states, the Sahrawi Republic and the Kingdom of Morocco, to engage in direct negotiations and maybe looking for a new ceasefire between them, but the settlement should be on the basis of the African Union Charter, and especially the Article number 4 that insists on the necessity to fully respect the inherited boundaries from the colonial era, which means Morocco in its internationally recognized boundaries and Western Sahara on its own. The next day, the Moroccan government declared that it's not concerned with this and it will never accept it. So the African Union is very clear, is behind the Sahrawi Republic as a founding member of it, and now we are really expecting within the UN system, within the Security Council, that the voice of the Africans will be heard. Now, on your question,
we only have a minute, Obi Bashir. We only have a minute, Obi Bashir. Yeah, but just let me ask: is the UN accepting the Moroccan climate commitments that include the occupied Western Sahara? And are you calling on these commitments, the UN, to stop accepting these?
Exactly. That is one of the major calls that we are making here, that the United Nations Conference on Climate Change should exclude and refuse to give credit to any data, any projects that are generated in Western Sahara, because they are generated within a context of a military occupation that the UN has refused to endorse. That's the position of the international community. That's the position of the UN, and that's what the international legality is saying. So the international climate system shouldn't operate in a different way from the international system. Justice is indivisible. It goes for the political settlement of the conflict, but also it goes for the legal status of the territory. And we are asking for a climate justice. Climate justice will involve that Western Sahara, the data on Western Sahara, should be excluded from the Moroccan reports, because Western Sahara has never been part of Morocco. That's the UN stand.
That's Obi Bashir, the Polisario Front's Europe representative, and climate change consultant Nick Brooks, who's worked with Western Sahara on its climate plan. We spoke to them at the UN Climate Summit last week. That does it for our show. If you want to see our documentary, 4 Days in Occupied Western Sahara, a rare look inside Africa's last colony, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.